Hi, I'm Lauren, and this is my video response for Module 5. For Module 5, we were required to read Chapter 5 in the textbook and also especially look at Highlight 5.1. We were also told to read the handout about the Imagine process for change, and then we have a discussion board topic. So I'm going to start with Chapter 5, which was about decision making for organizational change. So this chapter really broke down. Okay, so now that we understand organizations and now that we understand what macro practice looks like, how do we start to make changes at a macro level? So it really tackled things like, what do you do when you think your agency is being ineffective, or that there's something in your agency that needs to be changed, and how do you tackle that challenge? And it talks about how as social workers it's really our responsibility to help and to stand up, and when we see something that is ineffective or that needs to be changed, whether at a macro level, whether that's a policy that needs to be changed, or whether there's a program that's not working effectively and it needs to be revamped or something like that. So they talked about changing agency policies, creating and developing new programs. It really breaks down the process of the macro change. So there are all these steps and all of these different sub-steps underneath each step, and it really breaks it down to pretty. It seems like a long but manageable process for how to tackle all of these things. One thing I really liked was the table that they provided for evaluating macro variables. It was really helpful, and it helps break down all the factors, political climate, internal factors within your agency, all the different factors that can affect change. So I think as a social worker, this chapter was really important to read because you need to know all of these things in case you're faced with a situation at your field placement or in any agency that you might be a part of where you feel like you really need to make some changes to some of the policies or programs that they might have. And then Highlight 5.1, which we were taught to look at specifically, is about innovation. So I liked that it talked about innovation as being bright and optimistic. So innovation is really, just by definition, anything new to an organization. But when you talk about it in, innovation rather than just change, for macro level, it really makes it, more optimistic, I guess. So then the forum description, what we're supposed to talk about today, we were supposed to come up with a situation where social climate affected change. So the first thing that came to my mind was in the 1960s, the civil rights movement with African Americans and their rights. The first question, social climate, how does change begin? Change in that situation just really begins with first of all, recognizing that something is unjust or something is not right, and noticing that something needs to be done about it. So the political climate of the situation at the time was, very hostile. Like, politically, legislation was not on the side of African Americans. In some ways it was, but in many ways it wasn't. You have Jim Crow laws and all kinds of things that were put in place to make African Americans unequal to white Americans. And scarcity of resources. I don't know if scarcity of resources really affected the situation. I would say, if we're talking about actual advocates during the civil rights movement, I would say they definitely had a scarcity of resources because African Americans at the time were a very oppressed minority, as some might say they still are today, and they lacked the resources because they were so oppressed, and the situation definitely caused a shift in the macro level. So politically, socially, pretty much on every macro level that you can think of, things changed. Legislation changed. People's ideas changed very slowly. And really the layout of what our country looks like changed in the long run. So the final outcome would have been that African Americans were, it was a long process, but slowly given more equal rights and civil rights. And this definitely affects our socialization today, because we can now look at the change that happened with the civil rights movement and really apply that to a lot of other movements, where, where you see people that are a minority that are being oppressed and discriminated against. You can kind of, it's interesting to think about the civil rights movement, how that affects maybe the LGBTQ movement or movement for equal rights for immigrants. There are lots of issues today that we can still apply this to. If I was faced with the situation, I definitely would have been on the side. As a social worker, the NASW Code of Ethics says that it's our professional responsibility to promote social justice and show social change with and on behalf of clients, so ending discrimination, oppression, poverty, and other forms of social injustice. So if I were, around during the civil rights movement, I would absolutely be on the side of civil rights, because as a social worker, that's really, what we're there to do. So yeah, that's what I thought about this module.